right, I'm going to go ahead and I sent out minutes of the May meeting to everyone in the club and asked for any corrections or comments coming back to me. Nothing came back. So as the minutes were sent out in email, I'm dispensing with the reading of the minutes, and as there were no additions or corrections to them, and with no objections, the minutes are approved as distributed. Everybody?
Yep.
Okay with that? Okay. We're not very formal here, Bill.
Okay.
Okay. All right. Okay. Did that. Okay. You may have seen in Gary's email that we have $750 in our bank account. So that's a good thing. Okay. We are planning and hoping to have our first in-person meeting in the Orchid Club in September. You know, with barring any other major disasters or anything. I believe Gary did a survey, and everybody but one person answered back in the affirmative that they would like to be in the meeting in person. Now, a ton of rules came out from Oak Run Associates. Here's the Reader's Digest version. Masks are not required, Gary, I was in error. Masks are not required for fully vaccinated people. I thought they had mandated masks, but they didn't. We're going to have tables and they'll be spaced apart, and we're not supposed to put more than 6 people at a table. And then there's just a whole bunch of instructions for cleanup. And Hal and I volunteered to bring some cleaning supplies for this meeting in September, but going forward, we're going to be looking for volunteers to help with cleaning before and after the meeting. As usual with our club meetings that are in person, if you want to bring some water or soda or another beverage to enjoy while we're meeting, that is also okay. Now, just a brief summary of what's happening in November. As you all know, we normally have a November dinner and dinner meeting, and many times we've catered in Lee's Chicken. One time we had the club, the Royal Oaks Club, cater us. This year, the board has discussed Lee's Chicken again, as well as maybe all of us who would care to attend to the dinner to go to the Royal Oaks dining room, which can handle up to, I was at a ladies' luncheon the other day and there were 65 women in there, and there was still a lot more room for other people. So we're considering the Royal Oaks dining room, and it's very reasonable. They have an early bird menu, which they don't seem to care if you're not an early bird. You can order off that menu if you want to. So the price for the menu, which includes a salad and rolls and the full dinner, is $11.95. I might be off by 5 cents on that one. And then, but if you chose to order off their regular dinner menu, the entrees range in price from $16 to $24. So I just wanted to throw that out there for now. More discussions will ensue about that, but we hope to as we have done in prior years, have a nice year-end dinner, and then we take off in December because of the holiday.
And let me just that will be the second Thursday of November.
Oh wait, thank you for saying that. I forgot to put that in my notes. We have to modify our schedule in November if we want to use the club. The club has entertainment on Thursday nights, and so when we spoke to Sue, who's the manager of the club restaurant, she suggested we not do it on Thursday night. And I think all of us are flexible enough, and many of us are retired, that we can choose a Tuesday, Wednesday, maybe they're not open on Monday. And I suppose we could do it Tuesday, Wednesday, or Friday. So that's something that's going to need to be discussed. Gary, you have any comments or issues?
I didn't know there was a potential issue there, but that's fine. We'll resolve that.
Right. I'm not sure why the entertainment we would be inside in the dining room and the entertainment's outside. So I'm not exactly sure why that would be an issue, but maybe it's just they have so many people coming and they maybe not be able to serve us all, or, in a timely manner or something. I don't know. We'll find out though. Okay. All right, okay, that's it for the, before we get started business. Anything we need to tidy up at the end, we will. Okay, now I'm going to introduce Dr. William Van Lear, who also will go by Bill, Professor Emeritus Economics Department at Belmont Abbey College. And Dr. Van Lear is also a member of the Villages Democratic Club, and he's a part-time Villages resident. And Bill, I don't know if you saw my email or not. Did you have a photo or a picture you're going to show us later of Belmont Abbey?
Yeah, I did see that, and that was the last on my list to get to, and I failed to do that.
Okay.
Let me see if I can look for one tomorrow, and I'll send that to you.
Okay, great. I just want to make this comment. Hal and I used to pass by Belmont Abbey all the time. Sometimes we were traveling on business trips. We lived up in North Carolina. It is the most charming campus you have ever seen. It's just gorgeous, and that's why I was hoping to get a picture. Anyway, it's really pretty. Anyway, okay, so we'll go ahead with Dr. Van Lear.
All right, well, thank you, and thanks to everybody for the invitation, and to Linda and Gary for putting this together. If you like what you hear, I would love to come up and meet you at one of your meetings. I'll be back in Florida probably in December, if not before, for another 6-7 month stay as I go back and forth with my sister to do some home health care for my mother. So when I'm back in Florida, I would love to meet you if you'd like that.
We'd love to have you come to our meetings.
Well, that would be great. Okay, I'm going to do a 5-part but short presentation on inequality. Each of the parts are pretty short, but when I get to number 4, that will be the key section where I try to describe why large inequalities really matter, that they are pertinent to our democratic society, and why people should be concerned about the vast level of inequality that exists. But there's a few points I want to touch on until I get to section 4. Then after I complete section 5, we'll open it up for comments and questions. And then if you'd like, I also made a copy that I can share with you on a Word file of some of the questions that your group has already provided to me through Linda. So I could comment on those, or you could add to them, or whatever you would like to do. And I have a few graphics here too I'll be putting up.
Okay.
All right. Okay, so let's go with this little outline here. This is how I used to like to do it with my students. They would get outlines covering the broad themes, and then the talk and the discussion would again get into some nuances. First question here has to do, what do we mean when we speak of inequality? Then I want to address, why does inequality exist at all? And then why does income inequality matter to most Americans? So let's address those first 3, and then we'll get into the heart of the matter as to why it really is pertinent. What do we mean when we speak of inequality? For economists, it's generally about income and wealth differences, but inequality is measured in a variety of ways: healthcare statistics, family demographics, real estate and home ownership, all sorts of ways inequality could be measured, educational differences. But economists usually stress income and wealth, because if those inequalities are substantial, they're going to feed into every one of those other inequalities anyhow. So they're all really intermingled back with how income and wealth is distributed or concentrated. So let's go to a couple graphics here. Here is a diagram of earnings by group, and what the vertical axis is showing is the rate of increase of the earnings of a particular group over time. So it runs from the late 70s to almost up to our current time period. The dark line there is the top 1/10 of 1% of the income earners. And you can see how much more of that income is increased in that very small bracket of people relative to that bottom line, which is the bottom 90%. So it's 343 versus a meager 22% over those decades. So those income growth differences, of course, feed into what then we measure as income inequality across the population. And this is one of my favorites. This is a measure of wealth inequality. Again, here measuring the 0.1%, so that the top 1/10 of 1%, back in the early 1900s till a few years after the financial crisis. So you get a longitudinal or time series kind of view here of how wealth has changed in the United States. And you can see in the early part of the 20th century, it's up around 20 to 25% of the wealth was attached to just that very top small fraction of the population. And then we had a period there in the middle part of the 20th century where it was substantially lower, only 10%. Now that's still a lot of wealth to a very small fraction of the population, but it's a big difference coming from what it was coming out of the industrial age, the robber baron age, the age of Teddy Roosevelt, of the late 19th century, early 20th century. So it really come down a lot, then flattened out as the middle class grew and the lower class shrunk. And you might say in many ways, those were better times in some statistics, right? Some economic material terms, they were better times for a lot of people. And then the turnaround beginning in and around the very late 70s to early 1980s, really good demarcation line for the shift back towards much higher inequality. We can talk about some of those reasons why later on if you'd like, but that's a nice wealth distribution figure. And Gary and Linda have these so they can, if you want to take a picture, you can, or they'll send them to you.
Okay.
So that takes us to number 2. Why does inequality exist? Well, we probably all know at least some of the answers to this. And the basic reasons for some inequality is very, very much supported across much of the American population. Of course, skill differences, skill levels are going to vary across the population. Educational differences are going to vary across the population. Work ethic and work effort, right, will vary. People have different levels of a work ethic or work effort that they put into the jobs that they're doing. That does vary. Experience is going to matter, right? Usually higher incomes with greater experience than lower. So there's a variety of reasons why we would expect some inequality to exist. We live in a competitive economic society. Everybody can't be big winners. There's going to be some distribution of earning differences, and most people are pretty comfortable with modest to mid-level kinds of inequalities for those kind of reasons. And then number 3 asks, well, what does income inequality matter? When does income inequality matter to most Americans? Well, not most Americans most of the time, unless you're talking about vast differences. And of course, what different people might mean by that could vary a little bit, but we're not talking about tens of thousands of dollars of difference or even $100,000 or $200,000 of difference. By vast differences, I mean somebody making $1 million versus somebody making $20,000, or people earning 7, 8, and 9-figure incomes, of which there are some, when the bulk of people are between about $40,000 and $80,000 a year. Those kinds of substantial differences are a little hard to comprehend. Some people don't even believe of. When people are surveyed, often they think income inequality is much less than it really is. but they're tough to comprehend when we see the statistics, or to somehow justify those kinds of huge differences. A critical element as to why these differences are so big is when we compare property income to wages and salaries. Most people make wages and salaries. A small number of people make property income, and it's usually that group that's in the 6, 7, 8, 9-figure category. When people own enterprises, firms, banks, not only do they earn a wage or salary, right, for their labor efforts, but because they own the organization, all the money coming into the organization is not distributed directly to the workers. It's under the control of the people who own it. And those are the people who often have most impact in deciding how that money is distributed. And of course, it's pretty easy for them to pay themselves pretty handsomely when they're the ones that are responsible for controlling that kind of revenue base. Now, people do have disagreements about legitimacy of property income. Most people in the United States would argue that, yeah, property owners ought to get more than the wage earner, right? They're responsible for higher levels of risk taking, and all those organizational efforts, right? They have to be valued. Starting and expanding businesses or banks or real estate companies, that's no easy order, and people have to be compensated for that. They could risk and lose everything, right? Your property could go to zero. So the compensation's got to be higher than most workers in order to induce that kind of innovation and initiative. On the other hand, we just go back to these vast differences. Does it explain executive incomes that are 400 times the average pay? Does it explain hedge fund manager income of 8 figures? I mean, does property ownership justify those vast differences? And that's where a lot of consternation and disagreement, I think, enter into this conversation. So that takes me to the main point, as section 4 here, next to the last. There are basic reasons to be concerned about high income inequality, not that low level that I talked about initially, but those vast differences. And I would group into 3 areas: economic activity, speculation, and power. Let's take each of them. In terms of economic activity, people are earning, say, mid-6 figures and up. That revenue, that income is so high that it's often far more purchasing power, far more income than those people need to satisfy their consumption wants, even if they're living at a pretty high living standard. So a lot of that money is saved. It goes into pensions, brokerage accounts, hedge funds, Wall Street firms, all sorts of outlets. So a lot of that money is saved, and it's not spent. It's not returned to the economy in terms of consumption or investment that would generate jobs. And therefore, it can have a negative effect on employment growth and many people's income growth, because it's a drag on the economy, a drag on demand or stimulus. So that's one reason of concern. The second has to do with speculation. Jumping off from the first, high income people have the wherewithal to take a lot of risk and speculation that most people don't have, because we can't afford much loss. High income people can afford some loss, so they can buy some speculative stocks and bonds and currencies and commodities and cryptocurrency and the speculative real estate and move in and out of these markets, right, trying to make gains. Well, that can be helpful for innovation, but it also can lead to bubbles, right? Like we had in the financial crisis 12 years ago. A bubble was just a very high price for an asset, higher than justifiable for the earnings of the company or the income or GDP of the economy. Prices that are just out of whack, right? They're really high. They're out of sight for what would be justifiable in terms of basic econ. And bubbles burst, right? And they have detrimental effect on industries and jobs and bankrupt people. And then the last concern we should have for why inequality is pertinent and why you just shouldn't just shrug it off is power differences. So high income people have the ability to affect political, social outcomes to a much greater degree than the average American, right? So not only can they fund campaigns and not only are they often running for office, but they typically have a lot of importance or impact on defining what the issues are of the day, of creating the parameters for debate and discussion. So some issues are in, some issues aren't, because of the impact that they have through their economic connections and wealth. They fund advertising. They can fund lobbying efforts. So there's all sorts of ways to impact political outcomes, legislation, regulation, all sorts of things that are beyond the scope of what most people can do in any kind of direct fashion. So the high income inequality can lead to then great social and political inequality. So that's the main thrust of my talk. Let me end it, and I'll stop to see what questions or comments you have. And just something here on policy, you might ask, well, have we ever really addressed high inequality? Well, you saw it in that second diagram, right? We did in the 1930s to the 1970s period there, for like 4.5 decades long there of achieving more modest inequality, where you had a big middle class, bigger than we have today. Depending on who you believe or how you measure it, the middle class is about maybe 45% of the population. That's all. It used to be about 60. So it's well down from where it used to be. How'd we do that? Well, progressive taxes, right? We tax higher income people more than lower income people. Voting rights, we did it that way. We did it with minimum wages and collective bargaining. We did it with poverty programs, social insurance, the space program, and all the public investment into education, all sorts of ways that produce a lot of jobs and innovation and raised a lot of income and living standards for a much larger breadth of the population. So we've done it before, and we could use that policy to reverse the situation that we've been in for the last 4 decades. So with that, I'll stop for some feedback.
Okay, guys, does anybody else right now have a question about anything Bill has said? Any specific questions?
Remind you, you're muted, so the first thing you'll have to do is to press the space bar on your keyboard, or otherwise unmute yourself.
I've got a question.
Okay, Hal has a question. Can everybody hear Hal? He's been
Barely.
Barely.
No.
And I forgot to bring my headphones.
I'm having a little audio problems hearing it also, but maybe Linda can repeat my question.
I will repeat Hal's question. Go ahead, Hal.
How should the population react to these things? What should people think? Should they be up in arms about these inequalities, or should they just accept them and live with it?
Okay, I don't know whether he wonders if we should react, if the general population should react in any way at all. Should we ignore it or be up in arms about it? That was his question.
Well, I would certainly say the latter. I mean, I would place it at a pretty high priority. So engaging politically, writing congressmen, voting, educating yourself about the issue. I mean, it seems to me that that's an issue of prime importance for those 3 reasons I just gave, right? That it affects economic activity, therefore job offerings and pay levels. it can create financial crises through speculation. And then you have these big power differences, even though we're contextualized by small d democracy, you have these power differences that tend to make democracy less effective.
Okay, so this is a really complex issue, but two things. Bill, I'm gonna skip down to the corporate tax burden, and I'm also gonna talk about inflation. So there's a couple of ways to lessen the gap, and that would be lower the high end or raise the low end, right? Raise individual wages would be raise the low end, or put some kind of cap on the high end, and then we can squeeze them to, make the lessen the gap.
Yep.
So, what is your opinion? Have you read about? To me, okay, I'm going to back off. A number of years ago, when I was still working as a therapist in hospitals, I noticed that raises start to get down to 1% a year. And this was pretty striking, because prior to that, it might have been, I'm going to try to remember, I'm going to say 3 or maybe 2 to 4% a year, but down to 1%. And I thought that was really strange. So if there's widespread rises in people's salaries, just generally any kind of work, are there papers? Have you read? Is there some kind of prediction about rising inflation? When Hal and I bought a house in 1979, I think it was, out in Phoenix, Arizona, the interest rate on the houses was 14%. So please talk to that.
Well, the old-fashioned way of trying to moderate extremes would be through progressive taxation. So the wealth, or particularly the income of higher income people, those tax rates would be much higher than for middle and lower classes, and then they would fund either the social programs or poverty programs or education and so forth. Now, that's very difficult to do in the current political climate. It looks like we could only cut taxes, particularly for higher income people. It's really tough to get them raised anymore, even though we come from an historical context where that had become a very acceptable policy, even being accepted by high income people as something that you have to pay into to have the system that we have. So alternatively, I guess what some progressives have argued, right, higher minimum wages and renewed sense of unionization and collective bargaining. That's how you can get some of the lower wages and salaries up. My idea for the higher income is to establish a rule or a set of rules. One rule might be that no longer could executives at any level of company make more than, say, 30 times the pay of the average worker in their own enterprise. And that would be something that, because of the accounting requirements that public companies already have to do, we'd have that information. We could find that information pretty quickly. If you go back to the early 70s, that's what it was. It was a 30-to-1 ratio. And that's still pretty big, but it's a lot better than 350 to 450. And if you put that back in, the pay of the top people would have to go down, but it would be allowed to rise. It could only rise when the whole company grows, so that the average goes up. And then the top pay can rise as a consequence of that. Companies are about social productivities, not just individual private productivity of individual workers, but a social productivity, because there's a lot of cooperation. And so those profits and revenues need to be more evenly distributed, and having a 30-to-1 rule would be a way to go about it, but you would need federal legislation to mandate that.
Okay. All right. We're still taking questions from the floor. Barbara, and I'll go Barbara, Jim, and I'm sorry.
Sharon.
Sharon. Thank you, Sharon. Barbara, Jim. Barbara first,
Yeah, I have two questions. One is related to the structure of corporations. I just finished reading this book, The Socialist Manifesto by Sunkara. I don't know if you've read it,
I
but
have not.
okay, he talks a lot about the structure of the worker and okay, so I wanted to ask you if you'd read that. And I lived in Denmark for a while, so I saw a very different kind of social structure. So that's one issue, but it's well worth reading. It's a where do we go from here book in terms of income inequality. And the other book that I just finished reading is by Zuboff. It's called The Surveillance Capitalism. Have you read
I'm familiar with the author.
Yeah. So when you take the issues that you laid out, now she looks at a new world that we're living in terms of the connection, the digital connections, the global economy. So to think in terms of a corporation anymore is not the same as it used to be. And she goes in great detail into what Google is doing and in terms of us being the consumer of they're using us for our connections and doing things that we don't even know what they're doing with that information. I mean, positive, possibly positive, possibly not. But I tend to think positive because we're already there. We're in a new reality. So these older ways of thinking about income inequality need to be expanded. So I wanted to know what you thought about that.
Yeah, that's great that you're doing that kind of excellent reading.
This is a great Age of Surveillance Capitalism.
Okay.
And the Socialist Manifesto was from Rachel Maddow on MSN.
Oh.
It's her favorite book. It's her go-to book. And so I got it when she mentioned that, but I just read it recently. And it's very how-to as far as, say, a business became a cooperative or whatever it is when everybody owns it, and then how it grows or not. And it wasn't very positive description. It was the outcomes were not very positive from what Sunkara found. So trying to figure a new structure for business, for instance, is a really difficult question. And it's a little beyond me. So that's why I was wondering if you read it, but so I'm interested in your ideas.
Well, I think you're right about structure, and it reminds me about 2 or 3 of the questions that came in from Linda that your members had distributed to her earlier. And the questions were about structure in different kinds of societies, democracies or free market economies. How does structure affect inequality? What I was thinking about in terms of responding to those questions was something along these lines. Most societies throughout history have been highly unequal. So we can think of the slave societies of ancient times or more modern times, feudalism of the Middle Ages, or the very repressive societies of fascism or communism. All those societies have been highly unequal, and for somewhat different reasons, but mainly because of the huge difference in resources and power, how the power was structured. Well, I mean, capitalism itself, particularly if it's unregulated and it's allowed to move through time in any kind of unsupervised or regulated way, where there's social programs and taxes and all to mitigate extremes, capitalism itself will look like these other societies with very high levels of concentration. And we've been through a decade of 40 years of kind of downsizing some of our regulations and doing more free markets and more globalization and allowing companies to circumvent the restrictions, right? Some of the restraints that we'll put in the middle part of the 20th century. So structure definitely matters. You're right about some of the problems of co-ops and certainly government-controlled corporations. They might work for a while, but they don't have that entrepreneurial impulse for change and operating in competitive environments. So I think we need to find a way, perhaps through institutionalizing rules about how income must be distributed, but in the context of private property, to maintain a democracy and economic freedom, but to moderate the inequality and reduce the power differences.
Okay.
Okay, Jim, Carol, did you want to ask a question?
Yeah, I had another question, but I'm gonna ask a different one. Given that now in the future, we're looking at a lot of changes in terms of how the economy works, in terms of who has the power and the money, and that's the Googles and so forth and so on. And it appears that government does not have either the resources, the capability, or the intelligence to do those take those policy actions that are needed, because they simply don't have the capacity, intellectual capacity to do it, or whatever you might want to call it. What would be your opinion on something like that?
On government's failure?
Right. Well, inability, I would not call it failure, but inability to comprehend and control those forces of intellectual innovation and so forth, such that the Googles and so forth of the world are not just American, they're global. And what they are doing is putting their expertise to the advantage of different countries and governments and so forth. But in return, they get to contribute policy that is to their benefit versus perhaps the general population.
Yeah. Well, I mean, there's certainly a lot of influence coming from private enterprise, Wall Street, and the corporate sector through lobbying and other ways to influence policy formulation. I think there may, in terms of government, a lack of appreciation for the difficulty that globalization and free trade would impose on the economy, that trying to transition people from the old economy or the downsizing firms to the new upstart companies with different skill sets, I think it was underappreciated how long that might take and how difficult it might be. I think something else that might have been overlooked or underappreciated, or maybe not even cared about by some politicians, is that once you create a globalized transnational system, the investment often goes to where the places are producing the lowest cost. So the lowest wages or salaries, or the least regulations, the least taxes, the weakest unions. And that becomes then the common denominator in a competitive environment. A good example is just in the last month, right? This debate about can the developed economies of the world agree on a 15% minimum corporate tax? Well, it looks like they might come through with that, but it's not a foregone conclusion that they will, because it would disadvantage even some of the higher income countries, let alone lower income countries and where some of US investments have gone. So once you go to a global environment with countries that are very different in living standards and structure, low cost becomes the common denominator as to where the capital flees. And it keeps pressuring governments to allow that to happen, because if other companies or other countries are allowing their companies to take advantage of it, well, we got to do the same. Otherwise, we become uncompetitive. And that process then is just forced forward to its logical conclusion, perhaps in a couple of decades, of there'll be no corporate taxes and no unions and so forth. So I would make those two comments about government failure and miscalculation.
Okay, we're going to go to Sharon now.
Hi, yes. We've heard a lot about the what and where the statistics are, but I haven't heard a lot about the why. And I just wanted to bring in the idea of gender and racial inequality into this whole economic system. And we haven't really talked about that, because when you talk about power, all the power in America, at least, and I think depending on the country, belongs to older white men. Mm-hmm. And I don't know what we can do about that. And that is where we need to look, not at what it is, but how can we change it? Why did this happen? Well, I think we kind of know that. But what can we do about it from that end? I mean, we know what exists. We know the inequities, but we need to have a way to address them. Why, as a woman, as a teacher, and Linda as a nurse, why were we paid like 1% increases? Why are the essential workers still making minimum wage? This is where the inequality comes in, because people are not valued, and the rich get richer and the poor get poorer. I mean, it's always been that way. So how do we address that in the United States on a real equality basis that deals with these issues of gender and of race? Because I don't see it going anywhere right now. I really don't. And I'm hoping for a better future, but I'm in my 70s and it hasn't changed since I was a young woman for gender. So I'm just curious. Yeah. What are your feelings about that?
Yeah, great questions. I mean, I think you're right on that. Of course, trying to maintain ample voting rights, right? I mean, that's been an issue now for a while.
Yes.
What the Supreme Court did, right, with the Voting Rights Act, they weakened that now twice. So trying to maintain a voting rights system that encourages voting and participation and encourages it, making it easy, that would be important. I still favor, as I call myself a post-Keynesian economist, I like those progressive taxes. Thomas Piketty, the famous French economist who wrote about capital and income distribution a few years ago, he almost became a rock star as an economist, wants a wealth tax, because so much of the gains show up in the wealth of the upper income group, right? In terms of stocks, bonds, and real estate, that it's better to go after the wealth than the income. And some kind of global wealth tax would be needed. But of course, then again, we need the legislature's willingness and capability to do that within a political system that has a lot of pressure not to do that. And then I like my rule, right? The 30-to-1 rule. So if one limits high executive salaries, that pushes money down through the economic structure. So whoever is in that economic structure should benefit from that.
I hope so.
Thank you, Sharon. Bill, I'd like to come back to globalization for a minute, because what I was kind of hearing you saying is that we are at involved in a global race to the bottom right now. And what I mean by a global race to the bottom is to get goods specifically produced as cheaply as possible. And those people, and I'll translate that to those countries that can provide industry with an environment where the production can be done as cheaply as possible, they will be the ones that are chosen to make the goods. Now, I'm glad my husband's in another room right now, because he'd probably be whacking me over the head, because I'm going to mention textiles. We used to live in the middle of the textile manufacturing, North Carolina, South Carolina, and textiles were very fine and beautiful. And when you bought something from a reputable store, you could look at it, you could touch it, bring it home, open it up, see what the good quality was. And I have noticed and most textiles, I believe, are manufactured offshore now. And look, it don't matter if you buy it from Macy's, if you buy it from Belk, wherever it is. I bought some sheets recently, and I just feel like any minute somebody's going to burst through that door, but I feel like throwing those sheets out, because they're less than, I think, 4 months old, and they look like we've had them for 5 years. And so, is that right? You were talking about the race to the bottom?
Yeah, that would be a part of it. I'm usually thinking in terms of cost more so than quality or longevity of a good. But I mean, that would be part of it. Most of the time I'm thinking cost, because that drives the allocation of investment. Lower costs, even if prices have to come down, can mean bigger profit margins anyhow. And it's interesting about globalization. As an instructor, I look critically, but I try to teach students the pros and cons and the goods and bads, and how often in our lives there could be some positive things coming out of what otherwise we might be more critical of. Globalization has helped some other countries. It has increased some living standards elsewhere. Some of the products are pretty good. Sometimes the prices are lower for we consumers. When we're in that part of our economic life as consumers, we can get sometimes better products or products at lower prices. So globalization has pros and cons. Some of the negatives are pretty bad, and it really has negatively impacted a lot of blue collar manufacturing workers. Now, even there, the job loss isn't all from offshoring. More than half is from technology. Here's a good figure for you. I can't remember the exact numbers, but we think of the coal industry and we're thinking, well, that employment is down maybe the last 30 years or something. Well, according to the Labor Department, the peak coal employment was in 1912. So it's been falling since 1912. And a lot of that's due to innovation and productivity improvements from technology, not offshoring. Offshoring affected them since the 80s. But
okay, well, that kind of goes along with one of the questions that had to do with technological developments affecting income disparity. However, it sounds like you might think technological developments is going to have more of an effect on job availability rather than income disparity, which, by the way, if you can't get a job, there's an income disparity there.
Well, right. Yeah, that's right. I think more often than not, societies, if you look over time, the evidence suggests that technology tends to create more jobs than it destroys. But that doesn't mean there isn't a problem, right? It's the transition. It's the shifting of the resources. How long does that take? How big of a negative effect does it have on the people that are suffering from the change? Who's helping them? Is there policy to help in that transition? And sometimes there isn't any.
Okay. All right, I want to open it up to the floor. I see Jim, Carol.
And you're muted again, Jim. And Hal's got a question too. Go ahead, Jim.
Okay, Hal.
Oh, is Hal going first?
I don't know if you're going to be able to hear me better now or not.
Yes.
Okay. Two things. Barbara mentioned Denmark, and I'm just curious, is there a country or an area of the world that you think has the economic balance right? In other words, where would you look to if you said, I wish our economy was more like X? What would it be?
Yeah, good question. I would say some decades ago, a lot of economists of my stripe would think many places in Western Europe, but because of globalization and offshoring pressures and pressures on taxation and more conservative politics, conservative central banks in Europe, they too have suffered. Many of the European states have suffered from increases in income and wealth inequality. Typically, that effect in the US, in the Anglo-American economies, has been exaggerated compared to Western Europe. But most of those societies too have gone through similar experiences, just not as exaggerated as much. But I would still pick parts of Western Europe, Germany, France, the Scandinavian countries, parts of Britain, represent Canada, representing fine efforts at social and economic policy and having good reforms to their economic structures implanted in the 20th century that we can learn from. And they from us as well in some ways. But I would still say Western Europe, Canada.
And the second part to my question was your 30 times rule for the CEO's salary. How would you enforce it? Through a tax? If they passed a law tomorrow that said that, how would they enforce that? Or would they tax the corporation or the individual or how?
That would be one way. The other way would be through fines. So you would have to have somewhat of an enlarged government supervision, which is already in place. So through the Federal Trade Commission, through the Security and Exchange Commission, maybe it could be housed in the Labor Department, maybe in the Business Department of government. They would need some expansion in data, but it could easily be done without a lot of additional cost. I would say fines and lawsuits would be the way to try to enforce that, because it's so easily proved one way or the other. The statistics, if the government has them, they can make those are pretty simple computations.
Thank you.
Uh-huh.
And Jim Carroll, please.
Just a quick question. We've seen over time, I think, that we've had a lot of job creation in services. And does that indicate services, in my view, they may create jobs, but they don't necessarily create value, economic value. And also, I think there's been an increase in those who are rentiers that who like apartments and so forth and so on. Who does that affect, in case of the service workers, it kind of caps their ability to increase their income or their worth, and also to rentiers, are they going up into that 0.1%? More or less.
Yeah, I mean, some landlords, some, as you're calling them, rentiers, are in that high income category. I mean, some are in the upper middle class. But yes, I mean, that rental costs, housing costs are a substantial fraction of most people's budgets. And lots of jobs are in the service area. The bulk of them are on the lower end of the pay scale, certainly not all, but the bulk of them are. And that becomes a real impediment, right, to the advance of those people into the middle class, is what they got to pay for housing. The first decade of the 21st century became rather problematic for a lot of people because of the advances in housing prices and rents. And now we're seeing the same thing, even at a little more rapid pace in that first decade. And there's now much less housing construction compared to that first decade. So we're getting higher price growth with less construction. And yes, that would be a real imposition into the middle class.
Thank you.
Uh-huh.
Okay, all right, and Gary, I see
Yeah.
Gary's hand.
Bill, just in terms of using the taxation system to bring about some change for the betterment of society, would you favor income taxes, a progressive income tax, a wealth tax, or an inheritance tax? Which of those do you think would be most effective for getting some equality?
Any or all three, because they get at they get it precisely how the inequality is measured. It's generally measured by income distribution and wealth distribution. So all three of those kinds of taxes, if they could be effectively implemented, right, would be important in moderating inequality, and that was an important ingredient in the middle part of the 20th century. Now, for the latter two, that would require congressional legislation, because the Congress would have to require that financial institutions not only provide or require income statements granted to the IRS for tax purposes, but owners would have to also provide assets and liabilities so that you could measure appropriately wealth. But that could be done through legislation. Incomes are already provided in that mechanism, but you'd have to add in assets and liabilities. What you don't want to do is a consumption tax. And unfortunately, that's often how societies often opt for that, because it does have one advantage. It's really easy to administer, right? So you can see the attractiveness of it, but that's a regressive tax.
So is sales tax is under consumption, is that correct?
Right.
Okay, all right. I just wanted to ask you about the, some economists, maybe all economists, I don't know, think that the corporate tax burden is divided between consumers, workers, and stockholders. Do you adhere to that philosophy or theory?
Yeah, this is a great topic. And when I taught this in microecon classes, I usually tried to couch it in the following way. This is one area where it's virtually impossible to prove one theory or another through what evidence is available.
Okay.
So I think the argument runs like this, and it might not be completely pleasing to a person, but both sides have a little accuracy. On the one hand, because corporations have market power, they do have some choice in the prices that they set, the wages they pay, and the dividends they pay out. There's some flexibility there. Corporations are not driven by markets to pay only one wage or to charge a price. The corporations become the market, or they supplant the market, right? So they got some latitude. On the other hand, or anyhow, so that would mean they could shift, right? They could shift it to different constituencies. But on the other hand, I think a profit tax per se is a pretty efficient tax, meaning that the tax is paid by who it's levied on. That's what economists mean by an efficient tax. Or at least largely paid by the people it's levied on. And the reason for that is this: profits are a residual, right? It's a residual, or the difference between revenues and costs. Well, costs are not completely controllable. I mean, to some extent they are, but they're not completely controllable. Revenues are definitely not controllable. They fluctuate a lot. So no firm knows what their profits will be quarter to quarter. I mean, they can be way off sometimes. They guess, but they can be way off. And therefore, it's tough for a firm to know, well, okay, our profits have gone down a little bit. Is that because of the tax we're paying? Well, should we raise price? Should we try to cut costs? If they are successful in elevating their profit, the next quarter, the tax that they pay is now on a higher level of profit. So what do? Try to change price again? it becomes convoluted or complicated. So I think the profit tax is pretty efficient. They can't get around it. And I think it's largely paid by the people it's on. So I think both sides are a little right on that. Can they try to shift a little bit? Probably. Is it 50% or 25% of the workers? I would really doubt that.
Well, they moan and groan and complain about corporate taxes. They just whine and carry on as if it's going to be the end of the world. And they also actually say, okay, we're not going to be able to hire people because we're having to pay corporate taxes. Can you please talk to that?
Well, and that might be the best evidence. And I use this in the class too, what you just said. They always complain about it. If they could shift 90%, 80%, 100% of that tax, they would never complain because they could always get away with eliminating the effects of it. Because they lobby so hard against it and complain in public about it, you know they can't shift it all, or they wouldn't complain about it. So I think you're right.
Okay, all right. Let me see what I'm just looking at my notes here to see. So what it just is, God, this topic is so complex. But I've often heard whining about the shareholders. So I was reading some feeds on a social thing and talking about economics and whining about it would affect the shareholders negatively somehow. Can you weigh in on that, or does it affect the shareholders? I thought they paid the shareholders and then paid taxes, or am I wrong on that?
In the way the accounting statements are set up, out of gross profit comes interest and taxes.
Oh, okay.
And then out of net income would come the dividends.
Okay.
So the dividends are after the tax.
Right.
So they're complaining that a higher tax rate would mean that they got to cut dividend payments. Well, if they wanted to maintain their margin, I guess, or their gross profit margin and their net margin, they may have to cut dividends. It could also hurt shareholders even if they don't cut dividends, because if the tax hike forces the company to pay more in profits, the stock price will tend to go down.
Okay.
But that's an admission that they're paying the tax because the price went down.
Right. Well, that kind of that explains it a little bit. What it means to me, what that means to me. I don't remember I haven't checked the percent of the United States population right now who actually participate actively in the stock market. I think it used to be less than 50%. Do you have any information on it? Okay.
Yes.
So what that means is the other over 50% of people who do not participate in the stock market aren't receiving any benefit at all from these corporate dividends that are every year paid to the shareholders. And so all that does, to me, that participates in the wealth inequality thing, as the people who can afford to be in a risky market will be there and they will be earning, but the other people are not.
Yeah, well, and there's another issue of distribution, right? So that's a good example of it. And I would say it is about 50% that are not participating in the last 10 years in stocks. So that means only 50%, about 50% are. But even of that 50%, a good 80% have a small fraction of the stock and therefore a very small fraction of the dividends. Approximately the top 10% of the income earners have 84% of the stock and 91% of the bonds. So all that's concentrated.
Okay, well, that was what I was getting at. Okay, well, okay, folks, I see Sharon.
Unmute yourself, Sharon.
Unmute yourself, Sharon, please.
Unmute yourself. Sharon, unmute yourself.
Okay. Am I good now?
Yes.
Now we got you.
Okay, we're talking a lot about corporations, and I wanted to talk about something that's really important to me is voting rights and corporate contributions to political campaigns, and what influence that has and how we might deal with that from that perspective, because now, you know, a corporation can donate as much as they pretty much want to with a lobbyist. And so I'm real concerned in that respect when we talk about equality and that kind of thing, because it all comes down to voting and who gets into office and who decides what's what. So if we don't have control over who is contributing to voting, or have a cap on that, or some kind of control on it, the rich will still be the ones who are in charge of who gets elected. And that, maybe that's very fundamentalist, but yeah, I see that as a major problem. And I'm not an economist, but I really feel that if we can't control the donations to political campaigns from huge corporations, then the people who are at the bottom will never be in the middle or on the top.
Well, yeah, you're right. And, you know, the Supreme Court has eviscerated any of our campaign contribution regulations. Now, as far as I know, corporations cannot directly donate to a candidate, but they can from advertising and lobbying and campaigning indirectly, right, on the behalf of a candidate, or indirectly. All that has been legalized. So there's so-called dark money, and there's a variety of avenues and channels, right, for huge sums of money now to go into politics. It's basically open-ended. There's very little in the way of regulation. Some regulations are still in play for individual donations to candidates, but I think you're right. But the Supreme Court is arguing that money is speech, right? I mean, I think that's essentially their argument in some of their, and you know, those are bright people on the court, but I don't see that as constitutional, or why it should be that way. I don't think money's speech. I think money has to do with the volume of the speech. You could, if you want an analogy, right? So if somebody's got a lot of money, they're more likely to be heard, and for a longer period of time, than most everybody else who has much less money. So it has to do with the volume of one's impact, but it's not, I wouldn't equate it to speech. But that's the Supreme Court interpretation, which prohibits Congress from passing restrictive campaign laws.
Do you really think Congress can't move on that without the Supreme Court's decision? Do you not think that Congress can pass some laws concerning that, and then it's brought up to the Supreme Court at that point?
Well, yeah, they could do that, but if
they could, yes.
Yeah, they could. But I had to think more about this particular issue. I don't know what dimension of it has not been thought about or addressed. Maybe there's an angle that they could attack that I'm not aware of. But if the restriction that would be passed would be similar in vein to what we've tried in the past, even going the whole way back to Teddy Roosevelt, that would be challenged immediately and would work its way up right through the court system. And the Supreme Court would probably hear it, because it would be a challenge to an earlier decision or a set of decisions. So they'd have to find a new angle, I would think, or liberalize the court, right? You would have to have a court that would view their constitutional perspective would be different than originalists. Right now we got like 6 originalists on there. So if you had a more liberal 20th century type court, they might view the issue more of concern about power, right? Power, but not with a conservative court.
Okay. Here's what I'm going to do, folks. I'm going to start to wrap here. And Bill, I'm going to ask you to offer us a bit of light at the end of the channel. At the end of the tunnel. I have a theory, and my theory is that many people who are in a similar age group to us have really conservative leanings, and also, I mean, regardless of which party they're in. And some of the conservative leanings cause people to run screaming from rooms if a label such as communist or socialist gets spoken. And there's a young lady in Congress right now who, if you say her letters of her name in some circles, you're liable to get smacked, AOC. The light I would like you to try to share with us. When did you stop teaching regularly in the classroom? Was it in the last 5 years or?
Just last year. I retired June 1st, 2020.
Okay. Can you let us please know how the young people are thinking about some of these social aspects that would have a great impact on what kinds of laws get passed, whether we're going to have a more equitable society? My hope is that they're out there, and I just haven't met them.
Well, yeah, I think the national demographics are running in a progressive favor. Now how many or what fraction of that younger 2 or 3 generations, what fraction of them will stay politically engaged or become engaged? That's always the issue, right? For Democrats, liberals, and progressives, what kind of turnout we get, particularly in all presidential election years. But I think the demographics is running in our favor. I taught at a school that was very open and diverse for a long time, but back in 2004, they hired a very conservative Catholic, and there's a story behind it that takes too long. I could tell you when I meet you personally, but and that man has remade the school, and so now we're getting in the niche for Belmont Abbey College now is conservative to right-wing Catholic families sending their kids there. So
very sorry to hear that.
Yeah, I am too. They're not all that way, and some of them are still pretty open, but they're much more white and homogeneous than they used to be. Okay. And I think overall less open. So what's happened to that school is problematic for me.
Well, I wrote to you that I went to Gonzaga, and when I was there, it was very heterogeneous and very liberal, and you know how Jesuits are. They got to rock the boat anytime they get the chance, right? So I hope they still are that way. I don't know, but I'm sorry to hear about Belmont Abbey. That it's gone conservative.
That is a disappointment for a lot of the faculty, but also some of the staff. So we had a lot of turnover, and so there was some big issues for a while. There was also a Belmont Abbey. Some Belmont Abbey faculty got involved in a lawsuit against the school because the new president took out the healthcare support for contraception. So we got involved in that. The ACLU was calling us, and the National what was it called? The National Women's Law Center. We worked with, and that kind of thing. Well, the other side won, but anyhow.
All right, guys.
Yeah.
Let's give Bill a big hand and say thank you very much. This has been very enjoyable and informational. Okay, if you can stick around with us for a minute if you want to. I'm just going to call for any new business or any other things that didn't get handled tonight from the floor.
Hey, Linda.
Yes.
I'm going to leave, Linda.
Wait, okay. Did you have a question for Bill?
You bet.
Have you heard of Chris Hedges?
Yes.
Amazing intellectual. I learned a lot recently. If anybody has not heard or not that familiar with Chris Hedges, Google him. He's very, very fair. He doesn't like any politics in particular. But one thing I did learn from him is this. We focus on the race and the gender, that absolutely fine. I get it completely. I'm a Democrat. But as we're looking at here, if we don't get the equality and the economy right, if we start on that, that covers those things. And that's what made so much sense to me, is what you're talking about. And then even though the history is not perfect, why nations fail, I learned a lot of the history of why nations fail. And we are failing until we address this exact subject. So thanks, keep talking about it, because this is what we have to do. And Chris Hedges is an amazing individual if you want to learn a lot. I just blown away.
Is he an economist? I don't know. Is Chris Hedges an economist?
Sorry?
Is he an economist?
He's many things. He's a journalist. He's got, what's that award? Pulitzer Prize.
Oh, okay.
He's just, he's everything. He's even a priest. Not a priest. He's a Presbyterian, whatever.
Oh.
He's many things, but kindness is his number one thing. So there's that aspect to it. But he definitely knows about economies of the world because he's lived in various places. Right, William? I don't know how much you know, but what do you think of him?
Have you read Hedges?
Yeah, I have in the past, and I'm familiar with some of his writing, and that's thanks for reminding me about him.
You got to Google the most recent stuff. Is the hardest thing about him is he's a realist, and he's very pessimistic. But he said, if you don't face it, just like the scientist said, the scientists are realists. His pessimism, but it's the truth, and if you don't face the truth, you'll never fix it. Just like anything.
That's true.
Downer, you got to be ready for him, because I was pretty down depressed after hearing the latest. It makes you wake up and realize, whew, what he says is right, but it's really scary about where we're heading if we don't address like.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Well, thank you. I'm sorry if you were raising your hand. I missed you, but I'm sorry.
Okay, no problem.
All right, guys. All right, everybody. I think that's it. If no one has any new business or any other, Jim, do I see your hand? Jim Carroll?
One closing comment is that the founding fathers in their debates, both sides agreed that there was never a successful Republican government over all of history. And they anticipated that we could have a Republican form of government in the future, and how to address that, which they never were able to do. But they anticipated what is happening now, and how do we get by, how do we avoid what can happen. So when they talk about the Supreme Court, I think the Supreme Court doesn't really understand that, or they understand it and are not, don't care about it one way or the other.
All right. Well, on that positive note, I'd like to adjourn the meeting and thank everybody for coming.
Hi, Joan. I see a new face there. Hi, Joan.
Oh, yes, Joan. Thank you. Thank you for coming.
I'm happy to be part of the group, and thank you so much for having this forum. It was really, really interesting. I did want to say, if anybody is interested in diving deeper into the inequality issues that we have in America, a really good documentary is called Inequality for All. It was produced by Robert Reich, who was the Secretary of Labor under Clinton. And it's a fascinating documentary that dives very deeply into this issue, and yeah, it's a tough one, and it's very serious. But thank you all. It was really fun to be part of the group.
You're on our email groups now, right?
I am now.
I was just wondering if you could email me your information.
Sure.
You can get my email address, right?
Yeah, well, or I can just go back to the group and say, here's you mean my contact info and stuff?
Contact information, and just because I have some questions for you.
Sure.
Okay. All right. Okay. Thanks.
Yeah, I need to like pay dues and crap. Okay. Cool. Okay. All right.
Oh no, not pay dues and crap. Okay. All right, guys. Good
All
night.
right.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you for
See y'all
joining.
later.
Bye-bye.
Look for you, link to the YouTube of tonight's recording.
Thanks, Gary.
Thanks.
Bye-bye, everybody.